The political fate of Israel is now tied to a single audacious legal maneuver: Prime Minister Netanyahu's request for a presidential pardon. Now, supporters of the move are clear. They say that this is born out of necessity. Despite the defense exposing documented weaknesses and procedural questions in the charges, the trial continues to drain a nation besieged by crisis. They also believe that the pardon serves the highest interests of the state, and argue that it's the only path to genuine national unity, which will also free the Prime Minister to prioritize national security. And, they say, true justice demands ending a trial that many believe was illegitimate from the start. But the opposition calls it a catastrophic threat. They warn it would shatter the rule of law and split the nation. Some are floating the notion of a conditional pardon, which would force Netanyahu's exit from political life shortly before an election year, a consideration which is certainly more about politics than the rule of law, any way you cut it. Now, add the extraordinary international factor. U.S. President Donald Trump has publicly and privately demanded the pardon, calling the case an unjustified prosecution. From Ambassador Huckabee's courtroom visit to the president's direct tweets, this is an unmistakable American thumb on the scale, with potentially vast geopolitical consequences. How does this all fit together, and what are the considerations that the president can and may take into account? Welcome to Basic Law. I'm Elana Maisel-Diamant, Executive Director of the Israel Law and Liberty Forum. Joining us now is legal scholar Avi Bell to help break it down. Welcome, Avi. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very, very much for having me, even if it's only virtually. You could probably see in the background that I am in an airport, and that's a runway and gates behind me. But nonetheless, it is a great pleasure to be here with you.
The pleasure is mutual, and we're going to have to just race boarding time, I guess. But I couldn't think of someone better to discuss this. So look, we should say this at the outset, you do have a small connection to the case, or one of the cases, because you filed an amicus brief years ago. Maybe you can talk to us about that just for a quick minute, but also I think it's important now to just briefly, as much as we can, explain what the cases are before we go into the question of the pardon, the legal implications, the political implications, so on.
Okay, so let me give you the 1 minute version, and then I'll talk about myself. So, in my small connection to this, so there are three cases. The Israeli media calls them 1,000, 2,000, and 4,000. There are 4 criminal charges associated with them. Case 4,000 is the biggest one of them, in that it has 2 criminal charges attached to it. The 2 charges are bribery and breach of trust. Now, this one's called the Walla case. 4,000 is called the Walla case because it involves an alleged deal by the owner of several media companies to get approval for a merger of 2 media companies, allegedly in exchange for Walla, a news portal, giving Netanyahu favorable media coverage. Now, the theory of the prosecutors is that this favorable media coverage, they call it unusually responsive media coverage, constitutes a bribe. There is a deal that was made between Netanyahu and the owner, and as a result, there was such unusually responsive coverage. So besides the bribe, they say, because Netanyahu was dealing in any way, shape, or form with the merger, that's breach of trust as well. Now, just to make things more confused, the name of the criminal paragraph, the paragraph in the criminal law that discusses breach of trust it's entitled fraud and breach of trust. And for that reason, there are a lot of media reports that describe this as if there's an additional charge of fraud. And there is not. Okay, just bribery and breach of trust. Now, 2000 is sort of a baby version of case 4000. It involved alleged talks between Netanyahu and the owner of Yediot Ahronot, a different media outlet, to get positive media coverage there. Everybody knows that Netanyahu did not get positive coverage. And everyone knows that what the owner of the company was looking for was support for a bill that would chop the legs off of a competitor Yisrael Hayom. Netanyahu ended up opposing that bill and even called early elections in order to make sure that the bill didn't pass. So it's very clear there's no deal there. But nonetheless, they say, the prosecutors say, talking about that deal that never happened was a crime of breach of trust. Case 1000 is a little bit different. It's the so-called gifts case. It's claimed that Netanyahu received alcohol and cigars from a few donor friends. And the claim is not just that the gifts were improper, because that would be a regulatory offense. If they were improper, then Netanyahu would be ordered to return them and maybe to pay a fine. That's happened in the past. What's the claim here is that the gifts were not just improper, but that they were connected with constituent service in such a way that they became breach of trust. You can probably tell by the way that I'm describing it. I think that all these charges are weak. Maybe weak is too nice a word. They're preposterous. I think that these charges should never have been filed. They've been around for a long while. The events allegedly occurred more than a decade ago. The police investigation was started 9 years ago. The charges were filed 5 years ago. We are nowhere near the end of this process. My involvement was very small prior to the filing of charges. When the Attorney General was holding a required hearing before making the final decision to file charges, I, together with some other prominent attorneys, Nat Lewin, Alan Dershowitz, and others, we filed a brief saying that charges that characterize positive media coverage as a bribe are dangerous to democracy. They're an offense to free speech. They're the kinds of things you should see in a country like Turkey and not in a liberal democratic state. I still think that I was entirely right in making those arguments, that we were entirely right in making those arguments. But I can say that in retrospect, I made a serious mistake in overestimating the integrity of Israel's prosecution.
I guess you've set up the second question, which is how the cases have been going in your view, because there's really split coverage about it. If you read one media outlet, it sounds like conviction is just around the corner. And if you read others, and I have to say that the others are primarily in Hebrew and primarily, I would say, more centrist or right-wing sources, then you are almost constantly hearing about all sorts of procedural issues and even harassment of witnesses. And so maybe there too, it's worth mentioning. I think it would be interesting for an international viewer, and many of the viewers are international, to understand this through Israeli eyes for a minute. What are Israelis seeing in the coverage in the administration of the cases?
I think it's absolutely right that we have polar opposite coverage in Israel, one of which suggests that the cases are falling apart, and on the other, at the other pole, that we're heading straight towards ultimate conviction.
Right.
And I have to say that I think both polar opposites are right. That is, I think the cases are falling apart, and I think that nonetheless, the most likely outcome is conviction on something. And let me just explain why. Right? Okay, so on the one hand, as
I'm sorry to
yeah,
cut you off, but just before we go into why you think it will end up a certain way, could you just explain perhaps some of the procedural issues that we've encountered? Because I think it's really important to try and lay out the facts. It gets very sticky when we talk about what will happen, because then it starts to get more political than it needs to be. Facts first, and then let's go with the analysis.
all right. So there's a number of different ways that the cases have run into difficulty, and they're not simply procedural. They're substantive. In some ways, the substantive stuff came first. There's a question whether at all any of the acts described, if they had happened as the prosecution had described, if they're crimes at all. And as I said, I and some colleagues put in a brief already before charges were filed saying they're not crimes, that there's nothing here to charge. And so that's been a question from the outset. But a number of different questions have arisen during the trial. And I have to say that it's startling the amount of incompetence that the prosecution has shown here, because when you're presenting charges on made up crimes, you should have a really easy time providing the evidence. I mean, you make up the crimes around the evidence you have, right? I mean, you see what you can prove in court, and then you describe that as criminal, and that's your all right. That's your charge sheet. But that's not what they did here. Apparently, they made up the facts as well as the crime. And so you have this bizarre situation in which they have all kinds of factual allegations that it turns out they never even checked, right? And so,
Do we have examples?
um, yeah, there's apparently no evidence that there was ever a deal between Netanyahu and Alovich, the publisher of the owner of the media outlets, for media coverage. There's worse. The 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 charge sheet lists 100 plus cases which are supposed to show that there was unusually responsive, positive coverage that was given to Netanyahu, and almost all of them are actually not positive coverage. Uh, Besides which, this description of it as unusually responsive, there's no standard by which to judge it against, what would be usually responsive against unusual response, and they never bothered to put together that case, right? They never bothered to put together that set of facts, and so you have just again and again, allegations they just can't demonstrate. Here, the charge sheet has a long set of gifts that are supposed to have been given. It turns out that the evidence that those gifts were given were that items, alcohol, champagne and cigars were bought by Milchan. And his assistant, who's a Netanyahu opponent, has provided the receipts. Now, what's the evidence that those items that were purchased were actually given to Netanyahu? She says she wasn't even there. She has no idea, and it's not quite credible that every single bottle of champagne, every single cigar that was bought by Milchan was given to Netanyahu over a 6-year period. That's not evidence. That's speculation. And so you have these facts that don't add up. And this is embarrassing. It's happening all the time. But there's something even worse, which is that it's coming out gradually that there's no authorization for a lot of the police investigations that are the basis of the charges. And the law is fairly clear in requiring that the attorney general has to authorize the investigation before it takes place. And what happened here is that the investigators were saying on the stand that they were investigating these things before they received any authorization. In fact, in some cases, they didn't even know what the alleged crime was supposed to be. Right. One of the police investigators said he doesn't know what unusually responsive um, coverage is, and he was never told that that's what he was looking for, and he obviously never looked for it since he doesn't know what it is.
So you say,
You have
despite
here,
all of
yeah.
these examples of what you would say are clear issues in the case, it's headed for conviction regardless.
I would say that there's two grounds on which this case should have long ago been dismissed, which is one, without proper legal authorization, that is grounds for dismissal without even hearing the case, right? And you have precedent for that. And then in addition to that, there's neither the facts nor the criminal theory hold up to scrutiny. There isn't here evidence beyond a reasonable doubt of any commission of crimes. So yes, both. I think that we should be headed towards, if not early dismissal, at the very least acquittal. But I don't think what's going to happen. It's not going to happen because the prosecution has really bet the farm on this. They've really stuck their necks out on these bizarre theories and incompetent and frankly corrupt behavior. Um, and a dominant theme that you're seeing playing out, not only in this case but in a number of cases recently, is that in a situation like this, the courts are going to circle the wagons. They're not going to allow their colleagues to be exposed for corrupt and potentially criminal behavior. They'll It's more likely that the courts will find some minor item to convict on, or something not so minor to convict on, and um, um, avoid having to confront the misbehavior of the prosecution. So if I had to bet on the outcome, my bet would be that if this gets to its end, there will be a conviction, unjust though it will be.
Okay, let me move you to the pardon, because again, we're racing your airplane. But
I'm fine. Don't worry about me.
okay, so Prime Minister Netanyahu, I suppose, sent a request for a pardon to the president. Obviously, there was an uproar on all sides, some for, some against. By the way, it doesn't split evenly right, left, what I can see. There are people that I know on the right that would like the cases to continue because they share your view of the fact that they don't necessarily believe that it will go to conviction, but they think that he should fight to the end and prove that he's innocent. There are others on the left who believe that it should be granted on conditions of his departure from political life. But the first thing that was said, at least by those in the legal crowd, was you can't be pardoned for a crime that you haven't been convicted of according to Israeli law. What is your take on all of this?
So people have made a lot of very bizarre, baseless statements, but let's start with the basics here. I think that it's been obvious for some time that this case is a miscarriage of justice. And I'm not the only person who's noticed this. It's an ongoing advertising campaign for the corruption and incompetence of Israel's prosecutorial system. It's an enormous waste of political resources. It's a political campaign rather than a legal one. It should have closed down years ago. It should never have, these charges should never been filed. So, what's the way out? One possibility is that the prosecution itself, the attorney general, can decide to pull the charges, and that would be a wonderful way to deal with this problem. But it's not going to happen. This attorney general is absolutely under no circumstances going to ever admit to any wrongdoing, and it will not be pulling the charges. Right? Um, and so, really, the only way out of this travesty is a pardon. The president is not required under Israeli law to wait for a conviction, to even wait for charges to be filed, is not required to even wait to be asked. Um, the presidential pardon power in Israeli law is an incorporation of the Anglo-American pardon that actually stated explicitly in a ruling of the Supreme Court in the so-called uh, Bus 300 affair. Um, the power is basically unlimited and completely discretionary for the president, right? And it's a power that's designed to confront whatever problems the president, in his best judgment, thinks need to be fixed with a pardon, and it may be individual justice. Um, or it may be, as I think in this case, um, a national need. This sort of case is an embarrassment. It's destructive to the rule of law. It should not have been prosecuted. It's obviously a political case, and this sort of thing is best put to rest earlier rather than later. The only reason that Netanyahu requested the pardon is because Herzog, the president, was being coy after he was asked several times to issue a pardon by others, including by the president of the United States. He said, I couldn't consider such a request until I receive it personally from Netanyahu. Now, he doesn't have to wait for a request from Netanyahu. He doesn't need a request from Netanyahu at all. This is just a way of trying to avoid the question. And so Netanyahu called his bluff and presented the request. But this is really has nothing to do with the personal good or evil of, personal good or bad of Netanyahu. It has to do with whether it's the right thing for the state of Israel. Herzog should not have waited until this point, and he should act expeditiously now to grant it. That said, also, it requires a certain amount of political courage for Herzog to take this step, and Herzog's career to this date does not demonstrate a great deal of courage of this kind. So I think the most likely outcome is nonetheless that he's not going to do it.
Personally, I've admired most of the things that the president has done. I agree that in certain cases he's made some surprising moves, put it that way. But it's a very difficult position, especially now because you have so much overt American interference. And I think maybe we should move to that before we talk about some of the way in which this is fitting into the broader legal chaos in Israel. Because what you now have is very, very explicitly American pressure and international geopolitics implicated in this case in a way that suggests that it is important not just for the fate of Israel, but for U.S. interests and for other partners in the Middle East. And I don't know exactly what you do with that. Personally, I've, always hoped that it would not get to this point. I'm sure you did as well, because there is an issue of whatever Israel's mess is in this particular case. There is an issue of Israeli sovereignty, and there is an issue of wanting it to be resolved internally that now seems like a lost cause.
Look, the United States has been involved in internal Israeli politics and, um, frankly, against its democracy for decades. Right? This is not the first case. It's not just American involvement in elections. There's a little bit of irony here that before Herzog was elected president, he in 2015 he was head of the Labor Party. I can't remember what they called it then, One Israel or something like that. And Herzog ran against Netanyahu and lost. And during the course of the election, it allegedly, apparently, his party received assistance from then the Obama administration, financial and logistical assistance that, again, according to the allegations, violated American law and Israeli law. It's Herzog is quite aware of what American interference looks like and how it interplays with the Israeli policy and electoral politics. But no, it's not a good thing. I can say that this is the kind of interference that bothers me a lot less than, let's say, the interference under the Biden administration, which consisted of sanctioning people with views that the Biden administration did not want to hear expressed out loud, which I can consider to be offensive, not just to um, American and Israeli law and American and Israeli values and interests. It's just offensive to any sense of justice and morality. I cannot figure out why anyone would think that such a set of actions could be justified. So we're looking at interference at the end of a very long set of interfering acts by the United States. This is hardly the worst. I would be happier if we developed a different pattern of interrelating. And given that this is one that what the Trump administration is doing here is, I think, consistent with both is American and Israeli values and interests, I think this is an improvement rather than something that is worse than what preceded it. So I'm not terribly happy about it, but I actually think the picture is getting better.
I mean, when you frame it in that kind of relative way, it's a little hard to argue. But I do wish we were more toward the ideal end of the spectrum. That being said, maybe you could crystallize a little more clearly why this isn't just a question of kind of a yes BB, no BB, prosecution good, prosecution bad. But just for a moment, you're an international viewer, you're watching this. When you talk about this being in American and Israeli interests, what do you mean?
There's this ongoing um, power grab by Israel's senior legal officials, especially the Attorney General and the Supreme Court. It's been going on for some years. It's accelerated recently. Just this week, there were a number of cases that made the headlines that show different pieces of this. So um, one example, there's a I'm sure that everyone who listens to you or watches you knows that there was a political fight over what was called judicial reform, or to opponents, a judicial overhaul 2.5, 3 years ago. There were very few pieces of legislation that came out of it. One that was passed limited the powers of the Supreme Court to issue rulings on the basis of what it calls extreme reasonableness, which is basically policy disagreements. And the court conjured up a constitutional principle that had evidently been somewhere in the ether for decades, but nobody had ever known that it existed, to find that law invalid. And now there's another one of the reform legislation that passed. It was a reform of the process by which judges are selected that would take away the veto power of Supreme Court justices over their successors. And there are other minor changes, but it basically would create a bipartisan or government and opposition control over the nomination process. And the court's now being asked to strike that down. That the same court that right now dominates the process is being asked to rule that the invisible made-up Constitution gives it this power permanently, and no democratic process can ever change or take away their permanent power to control their institution. And the court has issued an interim ruling saying, yes, that appears to be correct, and we will hold hearings and strike down or not the law later. To me, this is a shocking development. You have another one.
I thought you were going to mention the Attorney General weighing in on the legislation to split the office of the Attorney General and thereby remove its inherent conflict of interest between prosecutorial and advisory powers.
You have legislation about her powers. You currently have a battle about the government voted to fire her, and it's a bizarre situation. Which her office, the office of the Attorney General, is refusing to represent the government's opinion that it has the authority to fire her, and instead, the official office is supporting her position that she cannot be fired. Now, at the very least, that would seem to create a conflict of interest between her official duties and her personal interest, but apparently not.
I mean, when we start to describe these things, it does sound a little bit Helm, a little bit Kafka, a little Fiddler on the Roof, I guess.
And then right. You have the biggest one of all, which is there's this breaking scandal of there was a case about a year and a half ago.
Oh, we addressed it on the podcast in the past couple of episodes. This is the Stateman case and the former military legal advisor.
Yes, and so this eventually gone, like everything else does, to the Supreme Court. The Justice Minister appointed a special counsel to investigate it. The Attorney General is fighting that, and so he hired one, and the Supreme Court fired the special counsel. Said he could appoint somebody else. He did appoint somebody else. Back to court again, and now the Supreme Court has fired that one, or at least put that appointment on hold, pending a future decision in which it's fairly clear they're not going to accept a special counsel. That is, the conditions of appointing a special counsel are theoretically there, but no one will ever meet the standard. You have these power fights that are going on in the background of the pardon deliberations, and they're all, I think that they are the more potent political issue. The question is more a question of what are and should be the powers of the legal advisors and the court and the Attorney General, rather than this one case.
I completely agree with you. In fact, a lot of times on the show, I try to take a headline try take a headline and open up a broader discussion that goes back to systemic issues rather than the personalities involved or rather than the specifics of, let's say, highly explosive third rail discussions on major cases that have been driving the country crazy for 7 years, even a bit more. So I find it incredibly challenging. But you know what we didn't quite make clear in this, I think, very important answer that you just gave, which is when you say American and Israeli interests implicated in all of this, how would you expand on that statement?
Well, I said interests and values. So I think that there's a mutual value of democratic decision making and liberal governance. I think that they are very strongly undermined by the actions of the Attorney General and the Supreme Court here. I think that there's an interest in the rule of law, and rule of law is undermined when law is made up, from case to case for the needs of the political opinions of whoever it might be. Again, meaning that the rule of law is strongly undermined by this prosecution. It's strongly undermined by the other cases and the steps that are being taken by the Attorney General and the Supreme Court. And I think that rule of law is a central value in both the United States and in Israel. I think it's worth defending. Now, the interests are a little bit more abstract, but you have seen this administration, prior administrations have weighed in on cases around the world, prosecutions around the world, political prosecutions. There's an American interest in promoting democracy and rule of law. There is obviously Israeli interest in promoting democracy and rule of law in Israel, not just as a matter of values, but as a matter of national security stability. I think that the power grab that's going on and fighting it, restoring Israel to a democratic course, is an important step for both the Israel and the United States.
No argument. I want to thank you for your time today. And again, I know it's not the easiest setting that you found yourself in, and I look forward to hosting you. I really hope on other discussions. I hope that this is put to bed in whatever the smoothest way possible is, and that we get to celebrate it soon.
I very, very much hope so. Yes.
All right. Well, now, thank you very much for joining us today, and I do hope to speak again, as I said, on other matters.